afternoon, everyone. Today we have the honor and privilege of having Professor Savia Sachi with us to talk on normative fetish and the possibility of dialogue. Savia Sachi is a professor at the Department of Sociology, Jamia Millia Islamia. He has worked in the fields of political ecology, indigenous people, development, social movements, and conservation architecture. You're welcome, Professor Savyasati. You have up to 2 hours. I believe you want to finish it at 5. So you can conduct the session however you like to. Over to you, sir.
Thank you very much. And it's indeed a great privilege to talk to so many people on dialogue, which is the need of the times. And it is also a very difficult subject, though it uh, seems quite comforting when you hear the word dialogue, and also uh, it requires a uh, lot of thinking and contemplation before we can understand the nuances of what dialogue mean, especially in today's circumstance. Uh, what I'm going to do today is my talk to you is divided into three parts. In the first part, I will try and share with you my understanding of normative fetish. In the second part, I will try and talk about how are we to confront normative fetish in our lives. And finally, I want to talk about what does learning mean in the face of normative fetish. Uh, as a as a beginning statement, I want to say that these are extraordinary times, and from another perspective, this is not the first time that history has witnessed an extraordinary time. In the past, there have been extraordinary times, and uh, they have been difficult as well. And sometimes, if you look at it in perspective, perhaps they were more difficult than we think it is today. And this is a very important consideration for us to keep in mind to consider the possibility of a dialogue. We often tend to look at our times as the full and final termination of a certain set of crises. But if you look at it in relationship to other similar crises, or perhaps even more severe crises that have happened to humanity, then we get a lot of breathing space, and we get a lot of mental space to understand the situation that we are in. So we are in extraordinary times, but I want to say there have been even worse situations in the past, and therefore there is all the more reason we should not lose hope and continue to work towards understanding what a dialogue could mean. Uh, I think the most distinguishing feature of contemporary times, which is worthy of consideration from the standpoint of dialogue, is a normative fetish. Uh, uh, Hello. Can I request some more people to come on screen because it makes me feel a little more human. Otherwise, I am talking
Yeah,
to
turn on.
boxes and with no faces. Yeah, thank you very much, because an expression on the face is always welcome when I'm talking. Thank you very much. I mean, you may switch off on and off. That's okay, but at least some people should remain on the screen as much as possible. Okay, now when we talk of normative fetish, we are trying to understand those aspects of a life which appear to be intractable. By intractable, I mean for which we have no solution, which have been with us for many, many years and perhaps many generations. And because they have been with us for so long, we seem to be caught in a corner and not able to see through how to get over these problems. Some of these problems have come to us from the past. Some of these problems have been created in contemporary times. And we are we get into a frame of mind which makes us see that this is not likely to come down in the coming future. And that's the reason why we begin to worry as to what does all this mean and what is life all up to. Uh, so normative fetish has one important singular property is that it draws our attention to intractable social situations, intractable conflicts, intractable social relations, intractable issues. And these intractable issues are to be found in all walks of life. This is a very, very singularly important feature of our society today. Interactable in interpersonal relationships, interactable in the family, and you go up to the international level. We have a whole range of intractable questions that confront us every day. Uh, so, interactability in real terms mean that conversations have ceased or conversations are becoming repetitive. Discussions are not happening, and whenever we want to go for a discussion, we come back with the same sense of not having found a solution. Uh, Wherever there is a possibility of a dialogue, we are very respectful to each other, but we are not able to see how we can break the ice because each person has an equally valid and equally strong view of the matter. And thirdly, when we come to the negotiation table, we really don't have any other solution to the problem that we are facing. So when all these forums fail, I repeat, conversation, discussion, dialogue, and negotiations, right? When all these processes fail, we may describe such a situation to be intractable. Now, there are very simple everyday symptoms of intractability, which we need to keep in mind. And if we do keep these in mind, it will be very easy for us to understand how deep the problem is. Whenever a discussion comes to an end and people take principled stands, right? Uh, and all the parties concerned take a principled stand, and this happens largely in politics and in other spheres of life, we know that there is some problem somewhere. A discussion should never reach a point where somebody has to say openly that this is a principled stand. Principles are important, but when you assert a principled stand, it means that no further conversation can happen at this moment at least. Hello. Second utterance is, it is my view of the matter. When you have made a conversation, when you have discussed for a very long time, and you come to a point where things are really head on, and then somebody says, well, that's my point of view, and you have to respect my point of view. It is not important whether my point of view is right or wrong, it is my point of view. So, right? So, it is not the content of the question that is important, it is your sense of identity that has been put at stake. So, if I want to go and jump from an ocean, from a height into an ocean, it may be wrong, but that is what I desire. So you have to respect my desire, irrespective of whether it makes sense or not. When you hear these sentences, I feel like this, right? When a discussion or a conversation comes to this point, then we know that there is something happening, and it is coming to a point where dialogues don't seem to be happening correctly. The third situation where you can sense intractability is when somebody says it does not stand to evidence, right? You may make a claim, but it doesn't stand to evidence, which is to say that there is an existential truth of life and there is a normative truth of life. There is a scientific truth of life and there is an existential truth of life. And when these two begin to confront each other, you say the dialogue doesn't work. You may be feeling that way. That's okay, right? You may have a principled stand. That's all fine, but there is no evidence, and evidence is defined in a very particular way in science as in law. If you don't have appropriate evidence, then there is no possibility of a dialogue, irrespective of what your experience has been, irrespective of how much you've suffered, irrespective of your personal sentiments and emotions that are involved. Now, all these utterances happen in all walks of life, right? Ranging from face-to-face relationships to relationship between amongst family, between families, neighbors, community, nations, and transnational conflicts. A very important thing to observe about such utterances is that in these utterances we observe a very peculiar social phenomena. And the social phenomena is that differences degenerate into conflict, conflict degenerates into violence, and violence degenerates into terrorism, and terror degenerates into fear. Now, these things happen very fast. If there are no social buffers, if there are no boundaries that are respected, then this is a chain reaction. And you will see a small conversation that might happen between two people at a pawn shop over who's going to sit where can easily convert into a conflict of interests, conflict of communities, conflict of worldviews, conflict of personalities, conflict of identities, and this can escalate into mobilization, this can escalate into violence, and this can escalate into terrorism and the works. And we see this happening almost every day. And this is something to remember that this is how this is one important underlying structure of what we may call an intractable situation. When it escalates beyond your control, and there are factors, elements, notions, emotions involved over which you have no control, which have nothing to do with the activity that happened, it has nothing to do with the issues that have happened, but then it's out of control and it's like a nuclear reaction, and then it's done. Now, underlying this normal fetish, we have to understand a certain structure of social life. Now, this is slightly philosophical and slightly technical, so I would request you to be, if you don't understand the relationships, please stop me and ask. Now, all social life has to be conducted in at least three realms of activities. The first realm of activity is that you must have adequate and enough knowledge of things that you're doing. The second realm of activity is your political economy. Namely, you have to have resources, you have to have the political will, you have to have rules, regulation, laws, and all these things should be in place. And the third is your social structure, which is your understanding of social life. Now, to explain this, I'll give you an example. Uh, Imagine you have to construct a table. Right? What are the basic things that you would need for the table to be constructed? So you would first need the knowledge, which is to say, you need the knowledge of wood, you need the knowledge of a design, you need the knowledge of materials, you need the knowledge of putting the things together. So that knowledge is the first prerequisite that you would need. Now this I would say, this requires a certain scientific, commonsensical understanding of what is a tree, what woods are good, what woods have what quality, etc., etc. Then you need a certain idea of its political economy, which is to say, where will you get the wood from? Are the resources enough? What are the laws governing the cutting of wood? How much wood can you buy? What the price would be? What are the rules and regulations given by the state as to whether this table can be made or not, and the rest of it. So you have to have these two knowledge, certainly very important. The third is you have to have some understanding of a social relationship, irrespective of these two. Now, if any of these three fields of activity is not in place, you cannot make the table. For instance, you have all the knowledge, you get the best wood, you have understanding of trees, you have understanding of design, and you have a designer who has told you that this is how the table has to be made. Your political economy is right. You paid all the taxes, you got the wood at the right price, you followed all the rules, you got the labor, you signed all the papers, and that part is right. But your theory of social structure is not good, which means that all those people who are working to make the table cannot stand each other. They can't talk to each other. It could be either because of class relationships, it could be because of race relationships, or it could be because of caste relationships, or it could be because of interpersonal conflicts. These five people who have to make the table, the designer, the worker, and the master carpenter, they just don't get along together. Your table cannot be made. Similarly, you have a good understanding of social relationships, so your workers are very well tuned in, but your knowledge is poor. Your political economy is right, so you will get the wrong wood and your table will not be made, or you will have a wrong design and the table will not be made. Similarly, you may have good knowledge, you may have good social relations, but your law is wrong. So a table cannot be made. So all these three realms of social activity are absolutely essential for any human activity to happen. Now, what happens is that each of these activities needs to have an autonomy of its own. And at the same time, it has to have a relationship with the other sector of activities also. So, knowledge, political economy, and social structures must talk to each other in order for things to happen. Now, under conditions of normative fetish, either all the three sectors assert their principled stand and no work can happen, or either of these three sectors asserts a principled stand and no work can happen, or any two of these sectors asserts a principled stand and nothing can happen. So the designer says that look, this is the best design for this home, but the workers say no, this is not what we can make. We can't make this. Why can't we make this? Because the person who's asked us to make it has given us bad treatment in the past, therefore we can't make it for him. Or we can't work on this design. This is not what we've trained to do. We will do whatever we've been trained to do. You go find somebody else to do it. Now, in a democracy, it is very important that decentralization means that each of these sets of activities has its autonomy and independence to function. And should be flexibility for each sector to talk to each other and accordingly determine what the activity has to be. Under normative fetish, this does not happen, right? So any one sector of activity, if it asserts itself, it can't happen. For example, in the realm of science, or in the realm of science, somebody says, look, there is no evidence to support that a certain wood from a tree or bamboo is good material for making a table. It just scientifically doesn't work. You have to get different kinds of wood, but experience says that amongst the Adivasis, bamboo is the best material to make all the furniture. Right? Bamboo cannot be used to move. Bamboos cannot be made, cannot be used to make the infrastructure or the foundation of a home. But there is no science to prove that. But cement is the best material to make because science has proved the stableness of cement. So the process becomes that you then begin to get tests done for whether that material is worthy of not, and that gets into another kind of an intractable situation which we have to deal with. The second thing we have to understand is that to deal with these situations, we have with us three modes of understanding the world, three modes of knowledge that can be used to understand or deal with any kind of tractability. And we normally operate with all the three modes of knowledge to understand and resolve intractability. So I'll give you a list of the three modes of knowledge and I'll tell you how we work with these three modes of knowledge to resolve an intractable situation. And so the first mode of knowledge we may call charismatic knowledge. Now, charismatic knowledge is knowledge when somebody who has direct communication with Lord Almighty gives you a word of what is true and what is false. Because he has connection with God Almighty, therefore his word cannot be questioned. Whatever he says is the final word, and therefore there is only conversation possible to understand what the word is, but not to find a better solution than the word, or there is no possibility of improving the quality of the word in order to understand the life situation. The second kind of knowledge comes from tradition, which is the wisdom of our ancestors. So my ancestors have worked in panchayats for about 5 generations, and the rule of the panchayat says that you cannot marry outside, you cannot marry within the village, because everybody in the village is your brother and sister. And that generates what we call honor killings. Why? What is the authority of the word? Tradition. The wisdom of the ancestors, and that wisdom cannot be questioned. And the third is reasonable knowledge, where we say that we will try and find out for ourselves what is the truth of the matter. And we do not take anybody's word as the final truth, right? That does not mean we don't listen to other people's words, but we have to examine it critically, looking at so many factors of life, and then seeing what is appropriate and what is inappropriate. That we call reasonable knowledge. Now, in conflict, we resort to either of these three methods depending on the situation. So, if there is a conflict with two families, you will go and approach the panchayat, and the panchayat will say, according to tradition, this is what happens. If you don't like the wisdom of the panchayat, then you will go and approach a charismatic person. Yeah, please go and tell the panchayat people to help us. So if this charismatic person is in your favor, you will go and talk to the panchayat head and the decision will be influenced. The third possibility is if neither of these work, then you go to the court of law. And the court of law says, look, both of you keep quiet. I will examine the situation independently on evidence, and then the conflict is resolved. Now, each of these within themselves have a certain mode of understanding interactability, and each of them in relationship to other can also resolve the mode of tractability. But when each of them begins to say that my view of the matter is the final, then we come up with something called an intractable situation. And this we have witnessed very clearly when we were trying to understand how to deal with issues such as honor killings. The court said that it is not right, but the panchayat said that this is our tradition and you cannot disrespect a tradition. And there is an intractability there also. Uh, Now, having said this, I want to draw your attention to some instances of intractability to give you a more clear idea of what is happening in intractable situations. The first, I want to give you an idea of intractability in the realm of science and knowledge, where there is where there is a weightage given to testimony of evidence and to facts and empirical reality, where subjectivities are absolutely zero. How you feel about a thing, what your emotions are, whether you like it or not, it is it's absolutely immaterial, right? Uh, a very good example is the conflict between allopathy and homeopathy, right? Allopaths have no respect for homeopathy because they say nothing has been proved in the laboratory. There is no evidence to say how the homeopathic medicine works. Homeopaths say that allopathics have no idea what to do. We have to mend cases that are absolutely gone cases and we recover those cases. And our evidence is experiential, right? Our whole understanding of the body is very different, right? And it has a science, but that science does not seem to go well with what is the dominant notion of science, what is the dominant notion of evidence, what is the dominant notion of facts. The second area of this example is uh, in science and ethnobotany. Now, ethnobotany is a branch of botany where people go and examine indigenous people's knowledge of plants, use it, make patents of it, and market it. But modern science does not ask the question, how did indigenous people find out the medicinal properties of plants without physics, chemistry, biology, and mathematics? How did the forest dwellers know that a certain plant is very good to heal a broken bone or to heal an infected wound? Right? Modern ethnobotanists take that plant to the laboratory, extract the active principle, find that it works, patent it, but do not want to recognize the knowledge, the science, or the methodology that the indigenous people have, because that is not substantiated by any kind of empirical evidence. So they say all that is hit and trial, and that is very scientific. And this is an intractable conflict. And the reason is the moment they recognize that indigenous people have a method, right, then the hegemony of modern science would be diffused. My third example is from health. Most of us who go to allopathic hospitals have had traumatic experiences. We have heard of traumatic experiences. We've heard of wrong diagnosis. We've heard of over medication. We've heard of fleecing, right? And the result is when we have to take our decisions for our own health, we only go by experiential learning. I know that certain doctors can cure diabetes, so I go to the doctor and get my medicine, irrespective of whether it is scientifically proven or not. My household grandmother's nuskhas work for me, so I will use that. But then this intractable conflict between the existential reality of life and the health prescriptions is very, very suffocating for all of us. Then we come to questions of intractability in social structure, family feuds, domestic violence, patriarchy, interpersonal vendetta, honor killing, communalism, and racism. These are all examples of intractable situations in the realm of everyday life. In the realm of political economy, what is intractable is that we have opened up a juggernaut of a production system, right? It is massive. It has to deal with mass society. It has to deal with mass production. So we have a very, very intractable situation in that the rates at which we extract raw materials is 100 or several thousand times faster than the rates at which raw material in nature can regenerate. This is intractable. You can't reverse the process. You lost all the coal, you lost all the forests, you lost all the biodiversity, and there is no replacement for it. And this is intractable. The other side of this intractability is that the amount of waste that we produce, our innovative processes are not so fast as to keep up with the amount of waste that we produce. So we produce 200 tons of waste, and the recycling technologies can only take care of 1 ton. Our rates of innovation are not fast enough to deal with the waste that we generate. So we are caught on both sides. We are caught on the first side of resource depletion, and we are caught on the other side of waste management. The third element of political economy is that we are given to believe that the higher the GDP, the better the public distribution system, the more will be the distributive justice. Right? So you produce more and distribute it through a good public distribution system, and everybody will get whatever they want and there'll be well-being and happiness. But actually, what we see is that people have to wait in a queue for the turn to come for generations together. And a good example of this was demonetization, where people had to wait in queues and some of them didn't even get to the booth. And this waiting in the queue is a very intractable situation. How long will you wait? How many generations will you wait? So the result is that we have been reduced to being in endless waiting. Our whole personality, our whole being in the world is characterized by what I describe as endless waiting. And this waiting has to go on for generations. Upward mobility does not happen so fast. It takes many generations for somebody to move from a primary school in a village to a secondary school in a district town and then to a university in Delhi. Right? It is very rare that it happens in one generation. It takes at least 2 to 3 generations for that to happen. And that is the amount of waiting that is necessary if you want to work in the contemporary economy. Now, these are few examples of intractability of the life that we live in, intractable aspects of the life that we live in. And these are all to do with. So, when all of this comes to any one individual, what happens? So, each one of us, irrespective of whether we are poor or middle class or rich, we have to deal with several issues at the same time. right? Each one of us is coping with multiple crises, some more, some less. Some have better resources, some have less resources, right? And we find that our conceptual equipment to deal with these intellectual crises is wanting, is not adequate. We don't have words, we don't have concepts, we don't have principles, we don't have understandings to deal with the kind of crises that we lead, right? And the result is we are exhausted, we are anxious, anxiety, exhaustion, nervousness is on the rise. Because not because of anything else, but for the simple reason that we don't have enough resources, intellectual, moral, and spiritual, to deal with the multiple crises that we have to handle in our life. And this exhaustion overwhelms us in day-to-day lives. And when we are overwhelmed beyond our own resources, we are sunk into what we call fear. We are overtaken by fear. And the most dangerous and the most worrying part of this is that we have had to outsource our lives to agencies to deal with these problems. The doctor deals with our health, the insurance company deals with the security, the psychoanalyst deals with the mind, the religious leaders deal with the spirituality, the university teacher deals with the education. We have no agency in our hand to deal with this because matters are so complex. We don't have enough intellectual equipment to deal with them, so we go to experts, right? So our dependence on experts has increased, and as a result of that, our own agency to take care of our own lives has diminished, and this has led to fear, anxiety, and all other related problems. So all your lifestyle problems arise from this one particular attribute that we have no control over agencies. Now, is this much, have I explained this normative, the world of normative fetish appropriately? Is there any questions of this before I move forward? Is it adequately and appropriately explained? Can I get some responses, please? Yes, no, maybe, maybe not.
Yes,
Yes?
yes, sir.
Yes, sir. Yes, sir.
Yes, sir.
Okay.
It's probably explained.
Okay, then thank you. Now I can move to the next step.
Oh,
How do we deal with the normative fetish?
hello.
Hello? Yes?
Like, could you please a little slow down? So, like, we're
Okay.
in a-
Okay. So the next problem is how do we deal with a situation of a normative fetish? Is there a way out of a normative fetish? I will only share with you what my reflections are and no more than that. And this is a work in progress. So I'm very happy to get criticism, suggestions from all of you to improve this work in progress. I think it is a problem of methodology. And the methodology is something like this. Under conditions of normative fetish, we derive what is correct, what is normal from the pathological. Pathology is our benchmark to understand what is right and what is correct to do. I'll give you an example. I'll give you many examples of this. We are vegan. Why are we vegan? Because we are conscious of violence done to animals, to cows. Right? Why are we non-violent? Because we've seen the consequences of violence. Why do we want education? Because we know to be illiterate is going to make your life miserable. Why should we not eat sugar? Because it is diabetes. Why should we have no red meat? Because it is bad for heart. Right? So if you examine all the norms that you follow in your life, you will observe that they have been derived from a pathological condition. Right? There is, and this is the problem, that what is correct is derived from what is bad. So if I want to say, why should I not travel? Why should I not buy a car? Because it pollutes. Why should I go on a bicycle? Because my cholesterol level will come down. Why should I go to the gym? Because my cholesterol level will come down, my diabetes will come down. Why should I sleep early? Because anxiety gives me need to sleep. So please examine that everything that we do today is measured by a pathological condition and not otherwise. And this is a big problem, because we have no idea of what is true independent of a pathology. I went to a Tibetan doctor for a treatment, and she felt my pulses, and I said, how do you know what is the healthy pulse and what is the unhealthy pulse? She says, today I don't, because I only see unhealthy pulses. There was a time when I had an idea of what a healthy pulse is, right? There were people like this, and that healthy pulse I would keep as a barometer, as a landmark to understand what an unhealthy pulse is. But today everybody is unhealthy. So I don't know what a healthy pulse is. So I said, how do you judge? I said, somebody is more healthy and somebody is less healthy. That's the only way I can judge. I have no other parameter to know what is health independent of a pathology. And this is the fix of a normative. This is the fix of a normative fetish. Because we cannot know what is true independent of any pathological condition, we are bound to get committed and get fixed into a normative fetish, and we don't know how to get out of it. Because we have lost sense of what is correct and what is not correct. So what is correct is, science will say, that which is empirically proven, so your existential experience makes no sense. Right? If you ask somebody what is a good way to live in a life, you have to be educated. Why? Because you've seen uneducated people. You don't value health, education for their own value, but you value it because if you don't do it, something drastic will happen to you. Right? So our judgment is based on fear of getting into a mess. And therefore, we do the right thing. And this is a fetish. This is a fetish of our thinking. We have no idea of what it is to be doing a thing in its correct way. We just don't know how to do it. We've been told, we've been socialized by the world, not by our parents, not by our schools, not by our universities, not by the government, no one, but just by the amount of violence and destruction that has happened in the world. Our norms are determined as a derivative of the violence. We don't understand non-violence in itself. We understand non-violence because violence is bad. We don't understand dialogue as a value in itself. We need dialogue because if we don't have a dialogue, we get into a messy situation. Right? Now this is what I would say is the baseline of what I may want to call the normative fetish. And I have identified one particular strand which leads to this fetish, is that we subscribe to standards laid by pathological conditions to determine standards for my life. And in this, I lose my agency as a human being. I lose my own intellect. I lose the capacity of thinking on my own, of having a sense of what is right independent of a pathological condition. And the pathology is not only disease, the pathology is that I don't want to think for myself. My guru has said this is right, therefore it must be right. My forefathers said this is right, therefore it must be right. This is also a pathological condition. It's not to say that gurus are wrong or forefathers are wrong, but to lose your own sense of thinking is pathological. Now the question is, we are now in a pathological condition where we don't know how to do ourselves, right? How do we get out of that? I want to suggest one very important way to think through this pathology. That is to say, this pathology makes us think of ourselves in terms of all that the pathology thinks the self to be. For example, when you go to the hospital, how do you define yourself? The self is defined by your blood pressure, by your sugar levels, by your cholesterols. This is yourself, right? When you go to your office, how is your self defined? Your self is defined in terms of how much work you can achieve, how much is your output, how fast you can work, how efficient you are. Now, these two aspects of yourself are related to each other. The more you increase your speed of work, the more you will go to the hospital, and you have to abide by that notion of self which is given to you by the hospital. The pathology is that we don't realize that our bodies, our mind, and our spirit is not made to work at that high speed. We cannot work at that high speed. We cannot work as fast as the computer computes. We can't work at the pace at which Boeing 707s fly. The rhythm at which you will work is lost to you. So you're always wanting to be faster than yourself, right? The standards of who you are not within you, but they are outside you. Either by the determined by the hospital or by your universities. Who are you in a university? Somebody is does an MA, somebody is doing a PhD, somebody's got 10 awards, somebody who's going to go to America, somebody is going to become an expert in a university. So your whole life trajectory is determined by certain set of norms given to you by a pathological society. Therefore, you have no sense of what your normal is. Right? And the biggest symptom of this loss of yourself is that we have all forgotten how to listen. We don't listen to ourselves. We don't listen to people. We only listen to the requirements of a norm. Right? Somebody advises you in your office, you don't do this. You will say, you please keep quiet. You don't know. That is a rule that we have to follow. Somebody says, you don't have to publish in academic journals and get marks. You don't talk because the UGC says that if you don't have Scopus records, you can't get your next promotion. You don't have to write 10 papers a year. No, you don't know, because when I get my promotion, they will count how many papers I have written, and I will get points, and therefore I will get promotion. So all our standards of thinking, all our norms that determine a life are determined by fetish of norms that are given to us by a pathological system. I cannot write one paper a year because I will not get promotion. I will not get increment. So I must abide by the norm, even if it runs against my whole system. So I stop listening to myself. I stop listening to friends. I stop listening to anyone. I only, not only listen, I only remember the norm given by a pathological institution to tell me what to do. So we have to understand what listening actually means. And this is a pathological condition because we run a democracy in which everybody talks and nobody listens. You will have noticed when you go to a conference, 10 people are talking at the same time. In any meeting, 10 people talk at the same time. There is no way in which one person will talk at one time. Now, when 10 people talk at the same time, you must be 100% sure that this is a condition of a normative fetish. A true democracy will come in place when people learn to listen to somebody speaking. Nobody listens to anyone. People only show you the norm and the rule that you have to follow in order to lead your life. The only way to break out of the normative fetish is to try and find out a norm which is not determined by any pathological condition. So, what must you eat? You decide what you must eat not by looking at whether you will get diabetes or not whether you will get heart attack or not, by understanding your own body. You have to begin to understand your own body to decide what you will eat. And believe me, you will never get diabetes, you will never get a heart attack, you will never get senile dementia. We have to reverse the way in which you think of the norm in order to get out of the normative fetish. And to reverse the way, we have to understand that the time frames that we work in are not to be determined by any external agency. How much must I rest is now given to me because of my work routine, not because of how much my body needs. How much must I read is determined by what my professor tells me or what the UGC norms tell me, not determined by how much I need to know. The moment we begin to start doing this, we are likely to get out of fear first and then out of normative fetish. Now look at the way fear works. If you were to do a time allocation for your whole day, please mark how many hours do you think independently of what the institutional requirements are. Every minute of your day is structured in terms of what somebody else wants you to be. The health system, the education system, and your office. Your day is not structured, your time is not structured in terms of what you require for yourself. This shift is necessary, and to do this shift, one simple thing you have to do is to learn to listen. Learn to listen, and that is something that I will leave to you to discuss and discover, and maybe we can have questions on that as after I finish my last part of my presentation. You see, apart from all these things, the most important thing in listening is to learn, right? So when I'm in a crisis, what do I do to learn? I go to my professor, I read a book, I go to the encyclopedia, I look at books in the library, I search Google, I look at films, I look at drama, I look at theater, I look at whatever is possible in my range to derive ideas to understand what I'm going through. Now, if you look at the world that gives you these ideas, who are they? In my generation, we had poets, we had novelists, we had actors, we had thinkers, we had philosophers who were there in the public domain to give us ideas. Today, who do we have? We have TikToks, we have Instagrams, we have Bollywood stars and advising us on romance and deeper feelings. We have gurus telling us about what is spiritually right. Right? We have heroes and icons of advertising who's telling us what to read, what to not to read. Right? Now, this is very, very problematic. Our referential world has changed. The second important thing to note is we may read Bakhtin, we may read Gadamer, we may read Heidegger, and we may read many more such philosophers. But there is a very serious problem here also. The serious problem is that the more we study pathology to criticize it, the more pathology gets a new lease of life. The example is, there are so many studies of racism has not gone down. There's so many studies of the caste system. The caste system has not gone down. There's so many critiques of violence, but violence has not gone down. So we have to be very careful that the language of critical thinking that we choose should not reproduce the objects that are being criticized. For example, there is so much literature on communalism in India, right? And very, very good critiques of communalism, very, very vivid descriptions of the violence and the horror that racism and communalism does. So how do people read it? So I found somebody who read a book about partition and said, look, oh, you have done this to me. Okay, I will not forget this. I am going to reproduce it in my life. So instead of the critique, instead of healing the wound, the critique actually nurtures the wound. So our job is, when we write about violence, we should write about violence to tell the truth, but also tell the truth in a way that it heals the wounds, but not tell truth in a way that aggravates the wounds caused by violence. So when we read these great thinkers, we have to bear this in mind, that we don't reproduce those words, those concepts, those categories that they have done to reproduce violence. You know, conversation is a good word Gadamer uses, but conversation can also mean polite talk. Right? True conversation, as Gadamer talks about, is exchange of views, but that's what the normative fetish has to overcome. Right? So Gadamer does not give us a sense in Truth and Method of how are we to confront fear. And the first difficult problem is to confront fear. And the fear is not because somebody is standing outside your door. The fear is because what you anticipate you will become in 10 years. What you anticipate what your children will become. What you anticipate what your grandchildren will become. Given the state of the world that you're living in. And this, to handle this fear, is the most important dimension of dialogue. Dialogue can begin only after you have overcome fear of yourself, irrespective of how that comes to you. So I think this is all that I have to say for today. And maybe we can have a discussion now. We have 1 full hour to discuss, exchange views, exchange stories, and see where we can go with this.
Thank you so much for this intellectually stimulating talk, sir. Now we open the floor for questions and answers and discussion. So anybody who wants to ask a question, please go ahead. Vishal, yes.
Hello, Professor Sachi. I'm Vishal, and I recently graduated from Jamia. Currently, I'm pursuing masters from
Hello.
IGNOU. Sir, my question to you is, what is the role of wisdom in the creation of this normative fetish? Do you also consider wisdom to be a very conformist thing?
I think we have to be very clear what we mean by wisdom. So when you say wisdom, what do you have in mind?
I mean, the creation of this idea, suppose if I perceive, like, for example, if I persevere hard, the society will say that, okay, yeah, you have persevered hard, that is why you have succeeded in life. So, but if I fail, so that's one wisdom. And but if I fail, the same society would say, oh, you were swimming against the stream, that is why you failed. So again, so in either conditions, the society is somehow is, that is my notion. In that sense, I'm implying.
No, I would not call that wisdom. I would only say that a certain rule is being applied to you to judge you who you are. So the rule is that only if you get 99% are you brilliant. So that rule is applied to you.
Okay.
Yesterday, I was in a meeting and there was a delay in the submission of an MPhil thesis. Right? So, one of my colleagues told me that, look, you can't give them high marks because there is a delay in the submission of thesis. I said, what has got delay to do with the intelligence and the work of the student? Now, this faculty was trying to draw attention to a norm of the university administration. According to that norm, anybody who does not submit in time is not intelligent enough. Right? And that is not a norm to follow. That is a wrong norm to have. That's what I'm saying. That we have been trained to think in terms of the rules laid down by people who do not understand how things work. And we have to be very clear, where is your norm coming from? So suppose if somebody tells you that you failed because you didn't work hard. Now, are you going to accept that statement as it is being told to you? Or are you going to find a new norm for yourself? You failed not because you didn't work hard, because the circumstances are not good enough for you to work hard. You see the difference. I mean, intelligence has nothing to do with failure. In today's society, failure is an indication of no intelligence. Number of awards that you get is an indication of a success. Right? If you go in Ivy League universities, you are a better academic than somebody who's not gone to Ivy League universities. I think this is the norm that is leading us into a fetishized situation. This is the fetish of a norm. Society is the name given to that fetish. And society is who? If you look at very, very critically, society is who? 10 people? 5 people? Right? If you look around, you'll find 10 more people who say nothing. You will find 10 more people who will say, it doesn't matter. You start again. So you should be very careful. Who is the society we're talking about? There are 10 people, 15 people. But if you look hard enough and careful enough, you will find 10 more people who say the opposite. So the trick to follow is, Vishal, that when you're given a norm, to understand its validity, find a proof that refutes the norm. That's the research that you should do. And good scientific research is exactly this. Karl Popper told us that falsifiability makes a scientific proposition true. Similarly, falsifiability makes the norm valid. If it can't be falsified, then it is not a norm. Then it is a diktat. Does that help you, Vishal?
Yes, it did.
Right, who else?
I want
Yes,
to ask,
Kabir.
sir, so you mean to say that when we are talking about fetishism or what is normative fetish, is it always directly proportionate to power? Like people who are powerful, like you said, our ancestors, maybe doctors, maybe teachers, maybe my guru. So you mean to say that all this normative fetish that we are talking about in this session is all connected to people who hold power, as far as my understanding goes? Because when I follow a guru, I don't look at his credential. I don't want to verify his degree. Or for that matter, if I am listening to my teacher today, you are my teacher. I did not ask you that what credentials you have. Since you were assigned today as an instructor, I came into the room, getting this idea that you have all the power of knowledge, and today I will be learning something more from you. So are we talking about this whole idea of fetish? Normative fetish is about power, one thing, and second thing is that you said we don't listen to our own self. The problem is we don't listen. I don't know, I mean, I understood that you need to listen to yourself rather than listening to others. And yeah, um, I don't listen to anybody in this world. I only listen to my inner voice, and I have a lot of problem with that. I don't fit into the jigsaw puzzle of the socialized society. I'm not being revered by a lot of people. That does not make any difference. So my idea is that when you start listening to yourself, you normally are being, put into a category of uh,
Okay,
bad and other things. So I just
good
don't know.
question.
I just don't know
No,
what.
no, good question, Savia. I'll just clarify both of them. Uh, I'm talking of not people but norms,
Okay.
right? So
Yeah.
you don't question me. That's fair enough. I don't question. I didn't never question my teachers when they came to class, right?
Okay. Okay.
I didn't want to go into the credentials because that's a token of respect expected of us, of all teachers and all learned people. But that does not mean what they say to me is the last word on earth. With respect, I have to learn to critically verify things what they say. And a good example of that is when Buddha became enlightened and he came to his followers, he said, don't accept anything that I say without testing it out in your own life. And I think that is a tribute to the teacher. To not accept what he says without testing in your life, to get into a dialogue with your teacher and understanding this is a tribute to him. So in our Indian tradition, when a teacher beats it, when a student becomes better than a teacher, that's actually a tribute to the teacher. But when you treat the teacher as if surrendering your own capacity to understand, right? That is the fetish that we're talking about, which in simple language could mean blind faith, right? The second question about listening to yourself, you see, only when you are aware of the other will you listen to yourself. This is happening to you also. You're so aware of the other that you only listen to yourself. They only need to make one small modification in this. And this is a very important part of our own tradition, that we pay gratitude to others who make us listen to ourselves.
Fair enough. Fair enough.
Because had they not been there, we would not have become aware of ourselves. So we do. Gratitude means we respect. Good. I'm thankful to you that you made me aware of who I am. Right? And now this establishes a very different level of relationship with your adversary. You will be able to sit with your adversaries with absolute calm when you respect them for what they made you realize about yourself. हमारे ग्रंथों में हमारे दिस इज विजडम विशाल, कि जो निंदक होता है उसकी अहमियत बहुत बड़ी होती है. दिस इज विजडम विशाल. जो निंदा करता है, जो क्रिटिसाइज करता है, जो आपको अपना शक्ल, आपको अपने अपने अपना आपको आईना दिखाता है आपकी शक्ल दिखाने के लिए, वो आपके लिए उसका दर्जा बहुत ऊपर होना चाहिए. दिस इज विजडम. जो आपको आईना ना दिखाए, जो आदमी कहता है कि आपने मेहनत, आप फेल इसलिए हो गए क्योंकि आप नालायक हैं, वो आपको आईना नहीं दिखा रहा है आपका. तो देखने का मतलब, सुनने का मतलब ये है कि आप अपने आप को किस आईने में देख सकते हैं, और जो आपको आईना दिखाते हैं उनकी थोड़ी कदर करनी चाहिए. और सॉरी, और ये करना बहुत आसान काम नहीं है, क्योंकि हमारी जो इंडिविजुअलिज्म है उसके अंदर अदर के लिए जगह ही नहीं है हमारे पास. वी आर इंडिविजुअल्स बाय डिनाइंग द अदर. वो हिंदुस्तान की फिलॉसफी में दो बातें कही गई हैं. जो हमको आईना दिखाता है, एक फिलॉसफी कहती है उसको मारो, क्योंकि उसका क्या हक है हमको दिखाने के लिए हम कौन है. who is somebody else to tell me who I am? But the other philosophy says that the one who tells you who you are, shows you the mirror, is worthy of respect. Now, that there are two different norms associated with these two kind of philosophies. We are victims of the first, that whoever tells us who we are, we say, how dare you tell me who you are? Who are you to tell me who am I? Right? Yeah, either you're younger than me, or you're older than me, or you don't know me at all. So there are 10 to 21 reasons that we'll find to justify a claim that you have no one to tell me who I am. But in the other philosophy, that philosophy goes so far as to say, I will respect even a speck of dust if it were to show me who I am. I think this would be my response to you, Sabia, on both your questions. I hope that sort of helps you a bit.
Yes, sir. Thank you very much. Can I add this lovely doha given by Kabir? Nindak niyare
Please.
rakhiye angan kuti chhawaye, bin pani sabun bina nirmal hoye suhaye. So that is, I think,
बिल्कुल
what you are saying. Thank you very much.
एग्जैक्टली निंदक को हमेशा इज्जत दीजिए.
Right. Abul Kalam Azad, want to ask a question?
Yes, Abu.
No.
Abu, you wanted to ask something?
Vishal, yeah.
I
Vishal?
wanted to, can I ask a question if others are not asking?
Yes, go ahead. Go ahead, Vishal. Vishal, you need to unmute yourself. Or maybe there's a problem with his network.
You can write your question on the chat, Vishal, if network is a problem.
Right, in the meanwhile, any moments?
Yeah, Besad, may I?
Yes, yes, please.
Yeah, this is Deepti here, sir.
Hello, hello, Deepti.
Thank you so much. It was such an uplifting session, especially the listening part. Because I always thought I had some kind of listening in me, but of late I'm finding that I'm still at the base level, just downloading and what is called as factual information, just going into that, maybe touching upon a little bit of empathetic listening. But there's a whole lot of ground actually which is uncovered. My question here is, like you mentioned something, dialogue can happen only when we overcome fear, right? This is something which is bothering me. I mean, is it possible to create a holding space for others to dialogue by maybe showing some of our vulnerabilities and suspending judgments and just being there with who I am, just being, with a lot of understanding, even though I have not overcome my fear? Wouldn't it be a ground?
Deepti, that's a very, very, very deep question and a very difficult one. But I will respond to your question the little that I know about this subject. I think when you are there just as you are, you already overcome your fear. You cannot be just there as you are with fear in your mind. The moment you are overcome with fear, you cannot be there in the way you are. My second thought would be that when you are in a situation as you are certainly very vulnerable. Not because of fear, because you have decided to be yourself. And in a world of today, this is not an acceptable way to be. So people will react to you not because of what you are, but because they're not used to what you are, to seeing you in that manner. It does not subscribe to their norm of who you are, and therefore they will become very anxious. They will get very worried. It's like this, a student, I'll give you an example. A student came to me and said that I decided to take a year off and just be myself because I want to discover what I want to do. So she started to behave that way. So her friend circle got very, very worried. I said, why are they worried? She said, I am not in a hurry to finish my assignments. I am not in a hurry to go and apply anywhere else. Right? I'm not in a hurry to meet deadlines. So they come and tell me, what has happened to you? The date is going to pass, the deadline is going to pass. Are you not interested in your future? What will you do with your life? And then she would say, I will apply. What's the hurry? There's still a lot of time. And then when the application dates passed, they said, why didn't you apply? She said, no, I wanted to take 1 year off. And they went and talked to her parents and told the parents this is what is happening. The parents misunderstood the situation and they advised her to go to a psychiatrist. And then she came to me and said, what should I do? I said, you just be relaxed, go and talk to your parents and the matter will be clarified. So when you are yourself, that's not the way you expect it to be. So Deepti, other people will be anxious not because of what you are, because they don't know how to deal with it. So you have to be careful. You have to give them yourself in very slow doses.
Thank you. Thank you so much.
Does that help?
Yes, it does.
Thank you.
Okay, so who wants to go next?
Hi, sir. Yeah, this is Nitya here. I would like to just reflect something and also would like to ask you a question. So, sir, as far as I could understand the whole notion of normative fetish, I understood more it as a critique that were you trying to critique the whole idea of normativity, that it is somewhere a derivation of a pathological society. I mean, it's an outproduct of a pathological ideology, the whole notion of abiding to the norm. So, sir, is it also like, can we also understand the whole notion of norm itself being pathological? In the sense, because the whole logic of norm is anyway sidelining people who don't follow the norm. I mean, that is always this distinction between what is normal, what is abnormal. I mean, we always operate with this distinction. And that is where I would also see that how do we tend to violate the dignity of life of people who are minorities or, who are extremely on the margins. So somewhere, how do we understand the whole notion of this norm itself being pathological, because most of the institutions that we also see in our day-to-day life, maybe is that of marriage or it's that of family. I mean, there is a certain norm to it. But is there also a need to perhaps subvert this norm in order to produce, say, an alternative voice? I mean, that's what I wanted to understand, that I mean, can norm itself be, I mean, to me, I think that itself is a kind of a pathology, the whole pressure of abiding to a norm.
A very, very, very interesting question, Nitya. Thank you very much for asking this. You know what the anarchists say?
Sir, I really wanted to talk about that also, like the whole notion of anarchism.
I think this is a good occasion to talk about that because that I think will put your whole question in perspective. Anarchists have been misunderstood to mean people who like chaos. The way the word anarchism is used or anarchist is used in contemporary life is to suggest that it is a normlessness condition that people want. They want chaos, right? But the true meaning of the word anarchist, if you look at it in the tradition of anarchism, is to say that only if you don't take hold of yourself right? If anarchists talk about supreme self-responsibility so that nobody else can determine the norm for you. So if you don't take responsibility of yourself, then somebody else will tell you what to do, right? So if you don't take, for example, if you don't take care of your health, then doctor will tell you what to do. If you don't, if you're not honest with yourself, then the government will tell you what to do, or somebody else will tell you what to do. So the anarchists were telling us that you have to be a person with heightened sense of self-responsibility. Only then can you talk of norm as unnecessary. Now they are saying something very profound here. When they're saying heightened sense of responsibility, they mean two things here. They're trying to draw attention to two different ways in which social life is led. One kind of social life happens where the collective is overbearing on the individual, right? So that which is good for the collective is not good for the individual. There is another kind of social life that we lead where the individual is overbearing on the collective. So that which is good for the individual is not good for the collective. So our social life swings between these two poles. Either I'm listening to my family or I'm rebelling against my family. Either I'm listening to the state or I'm rebelling against the state, right? Either I'm following the norms or I'm not following the norms. Now, these are two pathological conditions of life. What we are looking for is a radical middle ground. I repeat, it is a radical middle ground. It is radical. Both the other extreme ends are radicalizations because both of them are violent. Both of them are aggressive. Both of them are not good for society. And the radical middle ground has this one singular property. And that is very difficult to get, Nitya. The rule is that which is good for the collective should also be good for the individual, and that which is good for the individual should also be good for the collective. Right? This is the radical middle ground. There is a second element of this radical middle ground, which we learned from the Truth and Reconciliation Commission in South Africa. What they said was, and this is some of my forest dweller friends also teach me this, they said, look, one extreme end of the pathology is that you remember everything. You don't want to forget anything. Right? You will remember even the twitching of the eyelid or the twitching of the lip or the raising of the eyebrow or the movement of your body. You will remember so many finer, minute details to do what you do. And the other is absolute forgetting. You forget everything that has happened in life. You make no sense of history. You ignore history totally. Now, under both conditions, life is not possible. Total memory and total forgetting are not good for life. The dialectics of life or the civilizational problematic of life is how much to remember and how much to forget. What to remember and what to forget. And that is not an easy question. So we're not saying norms are not important. We're looking for those norms which tell us what to forget, what to remember, how much to forget, and also tell us something that is good for the collective ought to be good for the individual, and something that ought to be good for the individual also ought to be good for the collective. We're looking for a norm that defines that radical middle ground. Does that make it clear for you, Nitya?
Yes, sir, absolutely. Thank you so much. I really enjoyed your lecture, sir. Thank you.
Thank you, Nitya. Thank you for your comments.
Right, who next? Mushtaq, you want to ask a question?
Yes, thank you, Professor. It was a very enlightening session as usual. I just want to ask what you stated related the fetish and violence, and also an important point that you embedded that even when we try to criticize the same kind of violence, we should try to bring down the levels of, or not try to basically reinforce the same. So my question basically is that the capitalism and the world in which currently we are existing, we don't, a majority of us, even if we are literate and educated, we don't have basically time to think about these kinds of important questions. And this fear always reinforces us in various manners. So how to overcome it? We never have been able to understand this pathology and the circumstances in which we are existing don't give us time, space, or have that kind of understanding where basically we can understand what kind of problems we are facing. So in a certain sense, this capitalistic kind of system in which we are existing have reduced us into non-beings, where these kinds of important questions or the system doesn't allow us to basically help us to understand. So how to overcome this problem? Because you deliberated about education, health, and other such systems. So how to overcome these problems? Because majority of, even if we are educated, we don't have this privilege of understanding and engaging in a dialogue with these kinds of problems that surround us. Hope I was clear in my question.
Mushtaq, I will give you an example of a student who came to me. The student came to me and said, "Sir, I am full of fear." And these are the exact words for many reasons. I am all the time working either for an exam or for a UPSC thing or for an assignment or something, and I have lost sense of myself and I'm very scared. So what should I do? I said, it is a very simple task that you have to do, but you have to do it consistently. If you can find 5 minutes a day for yourself, you've beaten the fear by 5 minutes. Only 5 minutes. You increase the 5 minutes to 6 minutes. You've beaten the fear by 6 minutes. Every day, every month, you increase 1 minute that you give time to yourself. And you've beaten the fear by that many number of hours. Right? And when I say beating the fear, it means that in that 5 minutes, you will do everything that you want to do. And you should begin by doing nothing. Because the fear comes from the fact that if you do nothing, you're wasting your time, right? That is a norm that we have been socialized into, that if you're doing nothing, then you're wasting your time. Opportunity costs are very high for doing nothing. Please understand that doing nothing is a very, very regenerative act. Just sit quietly and watch the sky for 5 minutes every day. And do nothing else. And you will see that you will start to overcome fear and you will find time for doing things yourself, for yourself. Just do this exercise for a week and see whether you can create more time or not. And you will see 5 minutes of doing things for yourself overcomes fear in a very, very substantial way. Only I'm asking for 5 minutes only, Mushtaq.
Okay.
Even if you're working in office, say in the break time that you have for 5 minutes, you're going to do just watch the sky and not sit with anyone else. That 5 minutes you overcome the fear of the institution, of your peers. It's a simple exercise. Try and do it and see if it works.
Thank you.
I hope that helps, Mushtaq.
Yeah. Yes. Thank you.
Vishal?
Hello, am I audible now?
Yes,
Yes,
Vishal.
sir.
Hello again, Professor Sachi. My question to you is, Professor, we had a lot of practitioners and theorizers on dialogue from different fields who talked about conflict, and conflict resolution is also a part of our course, and I am also interested into that. Now, Professor, your field work has been for your doctoral thesis, uh, if I'm not wrong, is Abu Jmar, right? Bastar,
You're right.
which falls in the red corridor. Sir,
Yes.
how do you see this dialogue there in the conflict region of Bastar, which is where there is Maoist insurgency? What is the how dialogue, what are the possibilities of dialogue with the tribal people and the whole with the conflict in that sense, if anything from the field, if we can know through your experience?
You know, this is again a very difficult question because Abu Jmar is only one instance of many instances that are happening in the world. Right? For instance, how do we get into a dialogue over climate change? Right? How do we get out of the limited utility of carbon trading? How do we begin a dialogue on violence? These things are very, very difficult questions. And I only can say that first and foremost, one has to keep ourselves alert for that one moment that may be available for us to sit across the negotiation table. When it comes, we don't know. How it comes, we don't know. Right? I'll give you an example. In the northeast of India, there were a group of activists who were trying to critique the World Bank intervention in the northeast. So the World Bank gave them a document which they wanted to implement in the northeast, and there was a public discussion on this, and the activists got down to write a critique of this and sent it to the World Bank. The World Bank produced another document larger than the first one and gave it to the activists. The activists then produced another document and gave it back to the World Bank. The World Bank produced a third document. Now the activists were in a fix. They said, we have no time to talk about World Bank documents because we are firefighting all the time. And the discussion was that each time we give them a document, they will produce another document. And how long can we compete with World Bank because we have no resources? And the World Bank has not enough resources to write documents after documents after documents. Right? Now, the discussion came to a point where it was said that unless you have something different to say on the negotiation table, until then this process will go on because you're all the time following the terms of reference given to you by the World Bank to talk about what you don't want. But you never said something what you want independent of the World Bank report. Right? So what is happening there was that they were only reacting to what somebody else was saying. It's like the pathology determining what is right. They did not have the time to think through for themselves what is it that they wanted. You see, so long as this condition doesn't arise, we have to learn to wait and work on those things that we really want to put on the negotiation table. You see, these conditions are not only in Abu Jmar, these conditions happen at home also. There are conflicts at home which are not resolvable because it is a question of identity, it's a question of resources, it's a question of property. Then what do? You have to decide what path of life you want to take. So a lot of people resolve the conflict by saying, I don't want any property, I'm going my way. You take your property and you go. A lot of people go to court. A lot of people buy time and persuade. So Abu Jmar का situation ये है विशाल कि वहां तो आदिवासियों के सामने सबसे बड़ी समस्या है कि अपनी सैनिटी को बचा के रखना. In fear, the most important, the most difficult task is to keep your sanity up. Because remember, a truth that we know, that nothing is everlasting in this world. Nothing is everlasting in this world. It may be 100 years, 200 years, but it has to go. The British regime looked like it was never going to go, right? But it did go. Nothing in the world lasts forever. If you have that clear understanding of that, then you will not lose your sanity for that moment. When the right moment comes for you to negotiate, and it might take 3 generations, it might take 4 generations. Therefore, you have to learn to wait. You have to learn to listen. These are not on-the-spot issues. Does that make sense?
Yes, it does. Yes, it does.
Asharuddin?
If you lose your sanity, Vishal,
Yes, sir.
then everything is lost.
Asharuddin, please turn on your camera and prepare.
Yes, sir. Hello, sir.
Hello.
My name is
Turn on
Azhar.
your camera, Asharuddin. Turn on your camera.
Sir, my camera is not working. That's why I can.
Oh, okay.
Okay.
Okay, sir. I'm indeed delighted of being part of this discussion, as we are from the same family. I'm a student of Nelson Mandela Center for Peace and Conflict Resolution.
How nice, how nice.
Okay. Thank you, sir. So my question is, and we have discussed the 3 types of knowledge. That one, charismatic knowledge, traditional knowledge, and reasonable knowledge. Then could you please just elaborate the first one, the charismatic knowledge, and how it creates this interactability?
You see, charismatic knowledge would mean that I have a direct communication with the divine and I have got a revelation.
Mhm.
God came to me yesterday and said that you should go and climb 2100 stairs and you will pass. Okay? So that is charismatic knowledge. Buddha was enlightened, so he had a charisma. He had knowledge. Now, charismatic knowledge can become fetish because you surrender your intellect to the individual and not to the knowledge. So I would, for example, there's a difference between Christianity and Christ, right? So if I follow Christ, I may not subscribe to all that Christianity does. But if I think Christianity is the only way to follow Christ, then I am done with. In the same way as somebody says that I have the divine word of Lord God, so follow me, right? So the person becomes more important than what the idea of what the God has said. So that distinction you have to make. So when the person becomes more important, then the idea gets sacrificed and then that becomes a fetish. It's the body of knowledge, is the word that is important, not the person who says it. When a body of knowledge gets represented only through the person, then that is a condition of fetish. And when the word becomes important, then you examine the word critically, irrespective of who has spoken it. And to examine the word critically has to be done with great amount of respect. So normally criticism in today's world means disrespect. That's the wrong meaning of the word criticism. Criticism means asking a question to know more, not to debunk. When we ask questions, we are seekers. We are not skeptics. Today, asking question has got a bad name. To ask questions is to know more. It is a seeker's job to ask questions. And you can only be a seeker with total amount of humility and respect. Right? But when you lose yourself as a seeker, and when you become a follower, from a seeker, when you become a follower, then the fetish begins. Right? So I am a follower of Christ, and I am a seeker like Christ, are two different things. I'm a follower of Buddha and I'm a seeker like Buddha are two different things. And what we don't understand is that Buddha in his lifetime was a very ordinary person. He became a big man only after 400 years. When Christ was living person, he was stoned. He was an ordinary man. Right? He became Christ only 400 years later. Right? Anybody who becomes famous in his lifetime is not a charismatic person. He's only a popular person. So Amitabh Bachchan is not a charismatic person. Shah Rukh Khan is not a charismatic person. They are popular people created by the media. No charismatic person becomes famous in his lifetime. His words are valued only posthumously. Does that make sense to you?
Yes, sir. Yes, sir. Of course.
Anybody else?
Dekho, I want to say one more thing. A true seeker is always ready to be corrected at any point in time. His word is not the last word, and anything that shows that he's wrong, he is ready to correct himself and improve himself. That is the job of a seeker. A follower will not do that. Does that make sense?
Yes, sir. Thank you. Thank you so much.
So, sir, can we say that in today's Indian great circus that is going on round ourselves, the normative fetish is being, I would say, imposed upon people so that people don't become seekers, but they become followers. They don't
It's
ask
not
questions.
imposed. People have willingly accepted the rule of norms and fetishized it.
I
To
don't know.
become a
I don't
to
know,
become
sir.
a seeker, Sabiha, to become a
Yes.
seeker is a tough job. It's hard work. And that hard work does not come so easily. देखिए, सबसे पहले तो आपको रात को नींद नहीं आया करेगी if you become a seeker. सबसे पहले जो सीकर होता है ना, उसको रात को नींद नहीं आती है, उसको भूख मर जाती है उसकी. तो फॉलोअर बनना तो बड़ा आसान है. आपने कहा, मैंने मान लिया. उसमें नींद बड़ी अच्छी आती है, खाना अच्छा हजम हो जाता है, पेट में दर्द नहीं होता है, डायबिटीज नहीं होता है, कुछ नहीं होता है उसके अंदर. जब आप सीकर बन जाते हैं तो ये सब प्रॉब्लम शुरू हो जाती हैं.
सर, अगर आप मेरी बात सुने तो मुझे आपसे ये बहुत रियल इंसिडेंट मेरे साथ हुआ है और मैं वो नरेट करना चाहती हूँ आपको. जस्ट
बताइए.
2 minutes, if you give me. So once I went to an LIC office to pay my premium, and it was a lunch time. So I was waiting there, so the person should come back on his desk and take my check. So there was a recess time. So all the LIC officers, so-called graduates, were on a table, and there walked in a man. I will not reveal his original identity. And it was the next day when our great Prime Minister Atal Bihari Vajpayee died, and our PM walked from point A to point B, yeah, along with his funeral, whatever was there happening in Delhi. So he walked some 4 or 5 kilometers. So this man who joined the table is telling the other fellows, what a great PM we have got. Mana, this is what he said. Mana, क्या प्रधानमंत्री है, 5 किलोमीटर चले बिना थके. So my next question when my fellow came was that, have we appointed a prime minister or have we appointed an athlete? हमने किसको appoint किया है? We have to judge a PM by the policies he made, not the endurance that he has to walk from point A to point B. But my fellow person told me, keep quiet. This is a Gujarati lobby. You cannot fight them. And I have to keep quiet. I couldn't raise my question. He says, shoo, calm down. This is a Gujarati lobby. You cannot fight them, So when we have like this fetish people, we cannot see any kind of progress in such society. So we are having a fetishism by people. How long can they walk? And if we are to really make a person with endurance as PM, I think I would vote for PT Usha than for anybody else, because उससे ज़्यादा endurance किसी के पास नहीं है. So we need to understand. आप अगर ये वाला आईना किसी को दिखा दें, बहुत गुस्सा आता है उनको. और ये वाला इंसिडेंट मैंने अपने सोशियोलॉजी क्लास में 50 बार बताया है. You know, I know that I'm in trouble at times, but it's okay. So this is what I wanted to say. This is my observation, that in this great Indian political circus, there is more fetishism than seeking knowledge or seeking the correct thing. Thank you so much for listening it out.
You know, I can understand your displeasure and discomfort with such comments, but you know, you have to, in a democracy, one has to allow for space for small little pleasures that people want to take in order to reaffirm for themselves who they are. ये सुनने की, to be able to listen requires that amount of generosity also. It's like a little boy wanting to appreciate his father not because of what a great man he is, but because he can, you know, climb up 12 stairs every day. I mean, that amount of generosity should be allowed. Fair enough. If people have that criteria for somebody who's worthy of veneration, fair enough. But I would say that the bottom line for any kind of fetish is reverence of life. You know, fetish tends to show irreverence for life. Fetishes undermine reverence for life. You see, so I would say that the young man at least has some reverence for something that is active. I would say that he didn't have any political perspective. That's fair enough. I will critique him for saying that he has no political perspective. But I would not criticize him for saying that our Prime Minister took all the effort to pay his token of respect by walking 5 kilometers. That's fine. Does that help, Sophia? Does that help with your...
Yes, it does help to laugh out certain things and make yourself feel happy about letting off things go, you know, like that sort.
Yes, yeah, you know, certain things, the wisdom, this is wisdom, Vishal, that you have to allow for inefficiencies, you have to allow for mistakes, you have to allow for incompleteness, you have to allow for the human factor to prevail. You have to allow for that. Normative fetish comes when you don't allow for small little fantasies, even if they are not politically correct. You have to treat the individual as an incomplete being. That is very important. We are incomplete by ourselves, right? And that is the source of our strength and not the source of our weakness. कुछ 4 लोगों को खुशी हुई तो बहुत अच्छी बात है. उनको नींद अच्छी आ गई होगी रात में यार, ठीक है. उन्होंने आपकी नींद खराब कर दी. देखिए, आपकी नींद खराब हुई ना 2 दिन के लिए, अभी तक आप चिंता कर रही हैं उसकी. देखिए आप, उनको तो दिमाग से निकल भी गया होगा.
नहीं.
May I ask something?
Please.
Yes.
Myself, Shabista.
Yes,
it was
Shabista.
really an honor to listen to your insightful lecture. So, it's my personal quest, I can say. As we see, there are so much noise around. So, how one can listen to oneself? I just want to.
The noise is inside you or the noise is outside you?
Both the sides, actually. The external world is impacting us, and that's why it is creating the noise inside me also. So,
how to share this? That's again a difficult one because you have to throw out all the external noises in your head outside. Throw all those noises out.
How to do that? How to do
मुश्किल
that?
काम है पर ये देखिए उसमें the more you give time to what you want to do, what do you like to do the most in your spare time?
I read.
Huh?
I read books and like I contemplate on things like issues which are going around in my personal life.
सोचने के अलावा what do you like to do?
Painting.
Start painting. Those noises will go. When you hear too many noises inside your head, take a canvas, take a piece of paper and start to draw. Believe me, they will go.
I'll try.
Please try and they will go. Guaranteed.
Thank you, sir.
Sir, I have another clarification to ask for.
Yes,
you
yes,
spoke of a radical middle ground, the position of a radical middle ground. So, sir, can you just elaborate on that? Because when we think of middle ground, it's always in the context of some extreme. So, is it a way of avoiding the extreme and taking a middle position, or it is about incorporating both the extremes and taking a more encompassing position? Like, how would you explain the position of a middle ground in our day-to-day extremities, like in any perspective of life?
the middle ground को जो आपने मतलब बताया ना वही आजकल चलता है. मिडिल ग्राउंड का मतलब है कुछ यहाँ से ले लिया कुछ वहां से ले लिया, दोनों की खिचड़ी बना के आपने कुछ बना दिया. ठीक है ना, कुछ ट्रेडिशन से ले लो, कुछ मॉडर्निटी से ले लो, कुछ अपना डाल दो और इन तीनों को मिला के आप एक खिचड़ी बना दो तो आपका मिडिल ग्राउंड हो गया. पर उसमें आप थोड़ा गौर फरमाएंगे तो उसमें ना इंडिविजुअल को फायदा होता है ना कलेक्टिव को फायदा होता है. उसमें किसी को फायदा नहीं होता है क्योंकि वो इश्यूज रिजॉल्व भी नहीं होते जिसके कारण आपने वो खिचड़ी बनाई. मिडिल ग्राउंड को ढूंढने का तरीका ये है नित्या कि वॉट एवर प्रोपोजिशन यू हैव इन माइंड एज ए ट्रेंड, right? Whether it is favoring the collective or the individual, try and find something that contradicts it. Follow Popper's idea of falsifiability. If somebody says कि भाई देखो the only way to become successful is to get 99% marks, ठीक है? एक आदमी ये बोलता है, दूसरा आदमी क्या बोलता है? The only way to be successful is to pursue business from childhood. दो एक्सट्रीम व्यूज हो गए. एक बोलता है कि अपने दादा परदादा के धंधे में चले जाओ, दूसरा बोलता है कि उनको छोड़ छाड़ के आप पढ़ाई करो और एक हार्वर्ड यूनिवर्सिटी पहुंच जाओ आप. अब मिडिल ग्राउंड क्या होगा? मिडिल ग्राउंड जैसे आपने डिफाइन किया वो ये होगा कि अभी कुछ पढ़ लेता हूँ, कुछ दादा की बात सुन लेता हूँ, दोनों को खिचड़ी बना के अपना कुछ बना लेता हूं मैं. पर हम जो कह रहे हैं वो कहने की कोशिश कर रहे हैं, you find an example which shows that going to Harvard is not the way to be successful, and you find an example which shows that following your dada's business is not the way to be successful, and you find an example that shows that both of them are not necessary to be successful, right? So you will find somebody who has actually followed his own intuition, right? He's neither following education nor is he following his dada and pardada, but he is following his own potentiality, his own skills. He's discovering himself all the time. And that discovering himself all the time is the radical middle ground, right? Because that will be good for the individual as well as good for the collective. Does that make sense, Nitya?
Yes, sir. Yes, sir, it does. Yeah.
I would say, Nitya, neither the path of the tradition nor the path of the charisma, but the path of reason would be the radical middle ground. And reason that is full of sense of wonder, very important. Reason minus sense of wonder is skepticism and cynicism. Reason with a sense of wonder is the radical middle ground. And sense of wonder comes from accepting your incompleteness as well as the other person's incompleteness. That allows for a sense of wonder. But if you say that you are the only perfect human being in the world, then there is no sense of wonder.
Sir, if I may ask one last question.
Please, Deepti.
What is the inner work that you do? Because I love the way you kind of answer, with humor. You're able to accommodate the whole world. You see both the dark and the light. So there must be something that you must be doing. It's a follow-up question to what Mushtaq and Shabasta were in fact asking. The outer noise we can block, but the inner noise, especially those who are into reading and the intellectuals, that's a huge burden. So you must have been successful in doing something in that area.
It's been a hard walk for me, learning through hit and trial. My teachers have been very good in this matter. And I did long years of field work in the forest, and I was totally inside myself for that. So my teacher told me, "Dekho bhai, you have gone into the world of the forest. Now you have to come out of it also." Right? So you have built a Chakravyuh around yourself to find a way to get out of a Chakravyuh also. Right? So what I try and do is to get out of the Chakravyuh that I have made for myself every day. And the little steps that I do is I try and do one thing better than what I did yesterday. And that's it. That's all I do. One step at a time. One little thing better than what I did yesterday. And that's the only aim of my day.
Thank you.
Deepti, we should understand this, that 1/100th of a second when taken to the sky makes a big difference of degree. Right? So this much of an angle when you take, like, it becomes this big. So that one step a day has that scope. And I have learned to understand that, no, okay, I'll share with you a wisdom that I have learned from my teachers, okay? And that might help understand what I'm trying to say about two modes of understanding norms. We all understand the capitalist world to be full of division of labor, right? So anything that exists is made by 200 people's effort, right? ये तो सब मानते हैं कि मैं अपने घर में खाना नहीं खा सकता जब तक कि 100 लोग अपना काम ठीक से नहीं करते, और उसमें से मैं 5 लोगों को ही जानता हूं और 95 लोगों को मैं नहीं जानता. Okay? Now, what we are taught to do is that what everybody gives us, we should accumulate it and call ourselves I. Okay? What everybody has contributed to me, my name, my education, my food, my shelter, my clothing, everybody who contributes to these little things that I have, I accumulate, and all that accumulation makes me my I and who I am. Okay? Now there is a reverse perspective. That without the contribution of all these people, I am nothing. Right? I am only empty if all these people were not to do what they have to do. So I have nothing of my own. Right? So what we do is we don't recognize the other side of the picture. We only recognize the accumulation side of the picture. If we recognize the fact that there is nothing that is there of me at all, मेरा अपना कुछ नहीं है, सब लोगों का दिया हुआ है मुझको. अगर if we accept this fact of life, then all light and darkness, Deepti, you can also accommodate within yourself. But the second half is very difficult to accept. Actually, who gave you your name? Your parents gave you your name. Who gave you education? The institution gave you. What is yours? Nothing is yours. If you can reconcile with that fact, right, then the task becomes relatively easier. It's not still over, but you have taken the first big step to do that. ये हम मानने को तैयार नहीं है कि हम हैं कुछ नहीं, क्योंकि जो कुछ हमको दिया गया है किसी और का दिया गया है. परवरदिगार का तो छोड़ो आप, ये दूसरे इंसान का दिया हुआ हमको जो हमारे पास है. अगर ये हम कबूल कर लें तो हमारा गुस्सा चला जाएगा, हमारा एंजाइटी चली जाएगी, हमारी नींद सुकून से आने लगेगी, कुछ नहीं होगा हमको. हमारा बीपी चला जाएगा, हमारा डायबिटीज चला जाएगा, सब ठीक हो जाएंगे. पर जो हमने accumulate किया, we want to keep our accumulations like this. And that's a hard job, because it doesn't belong to you actually. Your name doesn't belong to you actually, it is a gift of your parents. And if you don't acknowledge that, then you're in deep trouble. So gratitude comes from there. When you accept your emptiness, then you become gratitude, then you show gratitude to others. So accepting your emptiness is the first important criteria to accept the diversity of good and evil in the stride. And believe me, Deepti, that's not a very easy thing to do. That's a very difficult thing to do. And I have tried to do that by doing one small step a day, as I told you. One small step a day. As I told Mushtaq, I recover 5 minutes a day for myself, and that's it. And in those 5 minutes, I tell myself, look, I am what I am because of other people's contribution. There is nothing that I have of my own. I remind myself of that every day. And it makes my day go very well. The day I forget to do it, it's a very bad day.
Beautiful, sir. Thank you so much.
Does that help?
Very much. It's a long journey, but yeah.
Sir, so it's 5 o'clock. Do we conclude here?
Yeah, I think we should conclude. And hopefully, I have
Yes,
learned
I have.
from all of you. Thank you very much for all your questions. I'm very grateful to you for listening to me for so long. And indeed, it gives me a lot of hope in myself and in you that we can have this conversation. And thank you, Bezat, for giving me this opportunity. Grateful to all of you.
Thank you so much, sir, for this very insightful, engaging, and thought-provoking session.